Thank you and good afternoon, everybody. I would also like to associate myself with the acknowledgement of country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, the good news about this session is we're not in the immediate post-lunch part of the afternoon, so people should be quite awake. And I think if you were in the last session, you would have been hard-pressed to go to sleep, because listening, I think, to the Minister and her perspective was a particularly good entree to this discussion. If you are very alert, you will have counted the number of people who were meant to be in the speakers' array on the stage, and you will have spotted that we are a deficit by one. So I regret to say that Emily, who was meant to join us, and I was quite looking forward to her talking to us about, particularly from a quantitative perspective, given her background in these issues, some of her observations. But she has learnt the lesson of the pandemic. She is unwell today, and she has rightfully, I think, taken the really good advice that we give people: if you're sick, stay home. So I think we on the panel are quite grateful to her for that. I've got, though, three extremely distinguished colleagues to talk to this afternoon, and I'm certainly hoping you're going to find this a very interesting session. I'm certainly looking forward to it. And it, of course, is important that we hear, I think, from their perspective about a number of the issues that are on the agenda for us today. You know, we're talking about us, can the centre hold as a central topic for this discussion? But as we know, there are many, many things going on in the global world. We know about polarisation and the threat that that poses. We know about social fragmentation and the really great challenge that offers, not just for governments, for people right across society. And of course, authoritarianism, which is something that I think we all watch with both a combination of slight fascination, but certainly a level of fear, is something that I think we're going to cover off in today's discussion. We have with us Misha Zelinsky, who is on my end down there, who of course has more than a fascinating career. He can talk perhaps about some of his recent experiences. We've got Lydia Khalil. Welcome, Lydia. Again, a particularly rich range of experiences and expertise, particularly in relation to transnational issues. And I think the person to my right needs zero introduction. If there's a constant presence in the media, it would be Senator James Paterson. But I think, again, a wealth of experience and perspectives to bring to this discussion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start just by reminding ourselves, the Minister did talk about the challenge we face in the future, and that's not just the medium term, it's the immediate future. But she told us that she was an optimist. She told us that if you look back, you see that we have faced challenges. She also thought that this was a more challenging time that we've had at any times in our past. There may be a couple of historians in the room who might have an opinion about that. But the reality is she was optimistic. She thinks, and I think she talked about this to an extent, that we have the ability to identify, grapple, and then not necessarily solve all of these problems, because they're not necessarily solvable, but what they can be is tackled proactively. So she was an optimist. So I'm going to turn in one by one to our speakers and get them to talk to us about these issues. Are they optimists? What is it they see? And what do they think the threats and challenges are? And how should we go about tackling those? And will the centre hold? So let me go to Misha first.
So is the question, am I an optimist or a pessimist? Or
I think will the centre hold? And you can tell us which of you you are.
It's probably, not to bore everyone with a personal story about myself, but when I saw the topic, will the centre hold? So it's actually one of my favourite poems by Yeats, Second Coming. And so the consequence of the centre not holding is that things fall apart and that anarchy is loosed upon the world. If you have a look around the world right now, it's not a great time. So there's plenty of cause for pessimism. I think when you look at the two big challenges, as I put them, around the world, you've had a 20-year decline in the number of democracies, and the state of free and open societies around the world are degrading within. So you've got the threat within, the threat without. And so democracies are not performing at home, and authoritarians around the world are on the march. If you just map it around the world a little bit very quickly, goes without saying, you've got a shocking, awful invasion. Quite hard to believe, but it's over 2 years now it's been underway in Ukraine, where an authoritarian regime is destroying a democracy next door because it doesn't like its choices. Similarly, we've got a war spilling out in the Middle East, which has, complex origins, but fundamentally the big toxic presence there is the Iranian regime, which is seeking to get its tentacles across the Middle East. And closer to home, we've got an authoritarian regime in the Chinese Communist Party pushing against what we understand to be a free and open society and testing democracies in a number of ways in the grey zone, as we all fundamentally understand. And so when I look at those challenges, individually they're all hard. Collectively, they're very difficult. The Dictators Club, as I call them, in North Korea can throw in there as well. They're coordinating and working together. When Hamas attacked Israel on October 7 of last year, they were using North Korean weapons supplied to them by the Iranian regime. At the same time, Russia was bombing innocent Ukrainians using Iranian drones supplied to them by the Iranian regime and also being resupplied by North Korean munitions on the front line. And behind the scenes for all those was the People's Republic of China providing the money and the inputs. And so make no mistake, the bad guys are coordinated. And the question is, to what degree are we prepared to coordinate in response? And so people say, it's the hardest time we've had since the end of World War II. And that's probably true. The Cold War was very testing as well, but fortunately it was managed through. And if you put it in very basic terms, the good guys won. But World War II required a huge effort of humanity to offset a very dark surge of fascism and evil across the world. And unfortunately, it wasn't like there weren't warning signs along the way. And so what I fear when I look at this now, a year ago I was probably optimistic that the bad guys are losing. If you think about the fact that the world is very close to abandoning Ukraine and what that would mean, we are either 2 years in to the moment when the bad guys got out over their skis, and the lesson was you can no longer do wars of conquest, and it's a really silly idea because you lose strategically, you lose in real terms militarily or economically, and then that lesson would flow on to others. That's one narrative. The other is that you can outlast and outweight democracies because in the end they're too dysfunctional and can't really go the distance. And we don't know what the lesson of that will be. But World War II didn't just start with blow the whistle, let's start World War II. There were a number of intervening events where the world was like, it's probably, maybe we don't need to make that hard call. Maybe we don't need to quite do that. Whether it was the Italians in Africa, whether it was Hitler marching through the Rhinelands, whether it was Japan staging small military incursions throughout East Asia. And in the end, those all sort of combined together into what we understand to be World War II, but there were moments along the way where we may have made different decisions, had a different outcome. So that's a very long way of saying that humanity is really capable of doing really good things when its back's against the wall. But unfortunately, we seem to wait till our back's against the wall to do that. COVID is a good example where we all rallied together and got the outcome. I'm not sure that we're prepared to do what it takes to get the job done. And unfortunately, everyone wants the easy answer. There isn't one. There are bad choices, which are helping the Ukrainians beat the Russians, which are resisting the incursions by the People's Republic of China in the South China Sea. There's assisting democracies in the Middle East, or there are worse choices, which is doing nothing and having to pay the price later.
And so let me just ask you one question to finish off that series of thoughts. Commentators recently have talked about the fact that the Second World War actually started before it was officially declared, and that essentially you could argue that we're in that same warm-up phase. Where do you stand on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think history is told backwards and it makes sense, right? You could easily, if you could map out a situation very simply where, let's say, the United States refuses to supply the Ukrainians Ukraine falls to Russia in some, maybe not completely, but in some meaningful sense. Perhaps then other dictators around the world decide that this is their opportunity, be it in the North Korean peninsula, be it in the South China Sea, be it in the Middle East. You could paint a picture where these things unravel very quickly. So, yeah, I think we very well could be. And unfortunately, we may have missed a moment here. Vladimir Putin's Russia is absolutely on the precipice of defeat, and we're going to snatch a collective defeat from the jaws of victory here because we don't want to send weapons and money. The Ukrainians are saying, we'll do the fighting, we'll do the dying, just give us the weapons. It's the deal of the century. It'll never look better than this. So I can't understand the reticence. It baffles me because it's quite an easy choice. No one's being asked to do anything difficult yet. And so the choices are only going to get progressively difficult if we let bad behaviour go unhindered. And Putin and others have shown us exactly who they are. And what the track record has been is that bad behaviour, unresisted, becomes worse behaviour every single time. And they are playing open-handed poker with us. I always say, you don't have to listen to me. Look, I'm a gibberer. Listen to them. Listen to what they're saying. They're being very clear with us about their intentions, their ideology, what they believe, and are enacting it, certainly in Ukraine and other parts of the world.
Thank you. So let me go to our next speaker, Lydia. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, good, it's on. Well, it's great to be with you all today and to be on this panel. This is a topic that I spent a lot of time thinking about and studying because in my work, I tend to look a lot at extremes rather than the center. So what's happening on the periphery rather than what's happening on the mainstream. And I think if you spend a lot of time like I do looking from that vantage point, there's a lot of room to be very concerned and very negative, because if you take a look at it from the extremist and fringe actors and the violent extremism that it can that comes into play and all of the different dynamics where there's so much wrong in terms of the threats that are posed to democracy from those actors, I think it's very easy to be pessimistic, but there's a reason why we call those people and those movements extremists, because they are not the majority, they are the fringe. And I think it's quite important to emphasize that when we're talking about issues that can impact democracy, that can impact our social cohesion, that a lot of that stuff is happening from the fringe, right? It's not something that's going on from the mainstream, which gives me a bit of a sense of optimism as well. But I think that taking a look at it from the perspective of the extremes and of the fringe can also be very useful to us in pointing out some of the pressure points and the issues that will impact the center, right? Because I think if you want to take a look at the whole, what's the most useful vantage point? Not necessarily from the center, but from the sides, from the periphery, from exactly that fringe, because it can account for it can help you pay attention to a lot of the things that we need to be concerned about. Because I think that while the movements and the individuals who might pose the greatest threats to our social cohesion and to our democracy, while a lot of us might not share with them their potential solutions or potential propensity to violence, a lot of the things that they point to and a lot of the grievances they have, I think many of us share, perhaps in the center. So what are the things that are animating these movements? Well, it's a few things that we should all be concerned about. You know, one of them is growing inequality. I think the level of global inequality has risen dramatically. Now, the slogan is between the 99 and the 1%. Now, that gap has grown wider and wider over the years for a variety of reasons, you know, related to, you know, neoliberal economics, lack of social safety nets, all of those things. And when you take a look at a country like Australia, which we pride ourselves on our social safety nets and our egalitarianism, as people see that inequality growing, and it has grown globally and also within Australia, that's something that should concern us all, because I think if you can point to one thing that is the biggest threat to a democracy or a pluralistic society, it is growing inequality. So that's clearly a point of concern. The other issue too, that if you take a look at what, say, extremists or anti-democratic actors are pointing to, One of them is the issues around, the lack of action on climate change. Believe it or not, that actually animates a lot of extremist movements. Now, the solutions that they pose to this are these eco-fascist solutions, right? That argue or forcefully argue against migration, or to promote this kind of exclusivist identity, this blood and soil type of a mentality of people tied to a place based on their ethnicity, which is a huge disruptor to our vaunted multicultural identity in a country like Australia. So that's something that we need to be paying attention to as well. And then also it's these trends of democratic erosion that Misha talked about really eloquently before, that while we have so many guardrails that we should be proud of within the Australian context, we're not immune to some of those dynamics that are leading to democratic erosion. Chief among them is distrust with democratic institutions, which is a big one, and with apologies to my fellow panelists, massive amounts of distrust of political actors and political leaders in Australia. One of the things that really points to this is the latest Edelman's Trust Barometer, which shows that polarization is really increasing to large effect within Australia. And one of the things that's pointing to that is not only a distrust of institutions and democratic governance, which has more or less always been a feature, I think, in the Australian context and in many democracies, but people pointing to politicians and political actors as the drivers for this polarization, first and foremost, and then media second. Those are two pillars of our democracies that are coming under increased strain and distrust among the majority of our population. So these are all things that we need to be paying attention to in order to ensure that our center does hold. Now, I am optimistic in that we have a lot of things, particularly in the Australian context, that can help us overcome that. Basic things around our systems around compulsory voting, which drives politicians to appeal to the center rather than the extremes, which is a big difference than, say, the United States, which is a strong ally of ours, which political actors, because there is no compulsory voting, have to appeal to their bases, to the ones that they want to drive voter turnout. So that's one of the major ones. Our election systems, the high degree of election integrity in Australia is another super important guardrail. The fact that we do have that sense of egalitarianism and that desire for equality and the strength of our multiculturalism is another huge guardrail as well. That makes us very optimistic. But these guardrails are going to be tested, and I think they're being tested right now, and they're going to be tested even more so into the future. And so in addition to strengthening these guardrails and paying attention to these guardrails, I think we also have to create new ones. So there's a couple of things that come to mind in terms of that for me. One of them is around this theme of optimism, is that we don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about it, and we need to be always attuned to the challenges. But I think that we also need to be spruiking. I agree very much with the minister's comments that we need to be spruiking our own mythology of Australian democracy is really important. I think Australians, as someone who's migrated to this country and come, from different contexts, having grown up in the U.S. where it's very common to, be very proud of American exceptionalism and all of those things. There's a cringe factor here in Australia about showcasing what we're good at. I think we need to kind of get over that a little bit to help us strengthen these guardrails, because there is a lot to be proud of. I think engaging in a sense of deeper, engaging our sense of identity around citizenship, first and foremost, can be particularly valuable, because I think now with our modern technologies, with our economic systems that we have in place, we're very much viewed as either consumers or users, and less so as citizens. And so conceptualizing ourselves as citizens rather than customers or users, I think is quite important to us going forward. And it's another way that we can strengthen that. And there's, a lot more things, many more ideas, a lot of people thinking about different ways to do this that I think are really, really valuable, both within civil society, within government, and all those efforts I think can help us collectively strengthen those guardrails.
So is there a message for politicians in there? And I say that quite deliberately, given that Senator Paterson's about to speak.
Yeah, there's one politician on the stage.
Yes, I know, but I'm just checking what the message for the politician is before he speaks.
Well, I think what people are really looking to is a sense that there is a sense that people think that politicians are responding either to partisan pressures, first and foremost, in terms of how they're conducting themselves and their decision making, and also to other interests, like corporate interests. And I think for politicians to really overcome that hurdles, emphasize that they're in there for public service. And I really do think, and maybe this is an unpopular viewpoint, many people get into politics because of their desire to serve their constituents, to serve their countries. I think there's a lot of noble reasons for many of our politicians to serve. And I think emphasizing that, conducting themselves in that manner, not losing sight of those goals, can help in terms of engendering kind of that sense of trust within the citizenry.
And just to finish the thought, advice for our colleague, you've drawn out the point about compulsory voting in this country, and it is something that really demarks us from others. And yet we seem to be learning the lessons from that divisive politics. Do you think that the importance of compulsory voting isn't completely understood here in terms of how important it is underpinning our democracy?
I mean, I actually think it is pretty well understood. I think if you talk to a lot of average folks and people who are working on issues around democracy, that's one of the first things that they come up with. And so that's something that we need to constantly recognize and to be proud of. But also, we can think of ways in order to continually innovate our democracies as well. There are other democratic innovations that we can be paying attention to. Things, moving beyond participatory democracy or even electoral democracy, taking a look at deliberative democracy mechanisms and how we can import that into how we conduct our governance in Australia as well, I think would be important for us going forward to meet these challenges.
It's interesting, isn't it? We talk so proudly about the democracy sausage, but the point about that is not the sausage, it's actually the democracy. And everyone turns up, has the opportunity to have one, assuming they're not vegetarian. Senator Paterson.
To come back to the original question, Jane, I am very cautiously optimistic. Optimistic because I do believe that our system of government is superior to the alternatives, and we'll talk in a minute about some of the challenges that those alternatives face, which I think are very fundamental to their design as a system. I do believe our system is preferable and superior, and I do believe in Australia at least our democratic institutions are very strong and haven't faced the tests that others around the world have faced. But I suspect if we did, we'd find that we would prevail as well. But it's a cautious optimism because I think the challenges that we face are very serious, more serious than they have been for a very long time and potentially existential. Just looking at the international security environment alone, not even worrying about some of our own domestic or internal pressures, the United States and its allies in the post-World War II era has never faced a potential adversary as significant, as serious as the Chinese Communist Party. Not Imperial Japan, not Nazi Germany, not even the USSR has ever come as close as China has in economic comparative performance, nor in military capability. It's certainly true in the Cold War that the Soviet Union at many times had a numerical advantage over the United States, but the United States always had a very clear and very decisive technological advantage over the Soviet Union. And you cannot sustain that same argument today with China, which is a peer competitor when it comes to all forms of technology, but particularly military technology. So that challenge that we face in the international system is existential, and particularly for a small democracy in the Indo-Pacific like Australia, which relies on our allies and partners to buttress and underpin our security. The possibility that our closest ally is in a phase of retreat from the world and returning to an isolationist past that it had in the lead up to other global conflicts is a very scary thought and should be provoking, frankly, a bigger and more serious debate in Australia about what we have to do to defend ourselves if we're ever called upon to do so without assistance. But let's think about the challenges that Xi Jinping faces. Would anybody in this room swap the problems that we have, as well documented as they are and as serious as they are, for the problems that Xi Jinping has? He's got an irreversible demographic decline. There is nothing he can now do to change China's demographic trends unless he decides to become a multicultural nation with massive immigration. I think that's probably not very likely. China's population will probably halve by the end of the century or thereabouts. No country in the history of the world has had a population decline like that and maintained its international power and authority, and China won't be any different, particularly because it's not yet passed through that middle income trap and achieved Western levels of per capita productivity. And everything that Xi Jinping has been doing in the economy over the last 5 years has been to centralise control and introduce inefficiencies in the economy so that the Chinese Communist Party can continue its dominance. So it's not like they're going to have some kind of productivity leap in the future unless maybe something unanticipated breaks through with artificial intelligence and gives them that advantage, but that doesn't appear likely. He doesn't trust his own system. He's just fired his foreign minister, his defence minister, the general of the rocket force, the 3 state-owned enterprise CEOs who provide the rocket force with its munitions have all just been sacked in anti-corruption drives, disappeared. He might be learning the lesson that Vladimir Putin didn't learn at the start of the war in Ukraine, which is you can't trust your army in an authoritarian political system, because it's not a very good career move to tell your superiors that we're incompetent and corrupt and poorly led. Instead, they say Xi Jinping, everything is okay, as they did to Vladimir Putin. And so with those kind of doubts in his mind and very serious now evolving economic challenges that started in the property market but are continuing, very serious youth unemployment so bad they've stopped reporting the numbers, I wouldn't take on any of those challenges myself, particularly or not if my publicly stated ambition was to effectively annex another territory just off my coast, which is one of the most complex and ambitious military exercises you could ever undertake. And now a world which has woken up to the seriousness of this challenge and is acting, maybe belatedly, maybe not with enough urgency, but is now acting and responding. So we do have challenges and we need to take them seriously and we need to move more quickly on them, but I wouldn't trade our challenges for their challenges any day of the week.
I think we understand the logic of that. So if you are currently the Australian government, you wish, where would your priorities be?
Just in my own portfolio for now, I won't range too ambitiously over my colleagues' territory.
Why not?
Maybe we'll get to that. The foreign interference agenda, I think, made great strides under the previous government, and we really have supported and buttressed our political institutions to defend them from traditional forms of espionage and foreign interference, like corrupting our politicians, interfering in our political parties, interfering in our media. That legislative reform was world-leading and has been copied by the United Kingdom and now Canada and others. The one undealt with part of that, which has not yet been dealt with by the previous government and all this, is the modern online component of that, which has put rocket fuel on the system of foreign interference and the ease of interfering in a democracy. And we've done in this country very little to deal with that challenge, that cyber-enabled foreign interference, whether it is on TikTok or WeChat or on Western-headquartered social media platforms, which are being highly successfully weaponised by foreign adversaries in a highly sophisticated way. We've really done very little to deal with that, and it's a major vector and a major vulnerability that we've opened up for ourselves. And I fear that we will recognise that threat only after it has been successfully weaponised against us. And so I think that's an urgent task.
So, Sasha, you've been either in or very close to a conflict zone recently, and we know that the cyber component of that war has been quite significant. Coming back to Australia, we can sometimes agonise about whether we're good, bad and indifferent at things. And I think the comment that's just been made about where there is an opportunity to do more, what do you think we should be doing, particularly as immediate priorities? And I'd like to draw out some of this stuff about the cyber and particularly test, I think, whether anybody thinks we do have the right tools as yet to counter that. But what would you be doing? Where are your priorities?
Well, I actually think there's a little bit of more fundamental question in this, and you touched on some of these points yourself, Lydia, which is that we won the Cold War not through the quality of our weapons, but through the quality of our ideas, but our lived ideas. People didn't read Karl Marx and read Jonathan Locke and Jeffersonian literature and say, you know what, I just think it's kind of Jefferson sort of articulated it better. West Berlin was just fundamentally better than East Berlin, which was kind of a crappy place to live, right? That's how we won the Cold War. Today, what Xi Jinping and others are shopping is you can actually have a middle-class lifestyle without any of that other stuff, don't worry about it. If you closed your eyes and walked around Sydney or walked around Shanghai, middle-class lifestyle looks about the same. I pick up in James's points around, yes, they've got huge economic challenges, and I share all those views. But the danger is it's not so evident the consequences or costs of the system. Now, we know what the problems are. If you want to speak up, you get locked up, et cetera, et cetera. And, I don't discount any of those things, and they're flowing into the economy are obvious. But that is the challenge, in that geopolitics is a results-driven game. And if democracy is going to win around the world, it's got to win at home. And so I talked about the big trend around the decline in democracy or decline in freedom around the world. But the big trend, and you've talked about this, Lydia, is the increase in inequality. And so you say to people today, you should support and defend democracy. If it's not delivering, why? And these are key fundamental questions we have to ask ourselves. And so trying to defend a system that's not working, young people don't want to defend that system. If you've been locked out of equitable educational opportunities, secure work, owning a home, having a bright future, why defend that system? Burn it down. And so the question is, could it happen here? We're talking about the clash between democracies and autocracies at that kind of macro level, but the real struggle in many ways is what's happening internally in the rise of authoritarianism within democracy. What that really is a symptom of a problem, which is that people are unhappy. The system is not delivering, and people are saying to us, to the ballot box, you need to change this. You need to deal with these fundamental inequities. And so can it happen here? I think people essentially are asking, could Trump happen here, is really kind of the subtext. Of course it could. Of course it could. The 2022 election that we had in Australia was the lowest total recorded vote for the major parties in our history. The only thing keeping the major parties sort of being in the dominant position is one, compulsory voting, compulsory preferential voting. That is really kind of the key element of our system, and it's a good moderating element of our system. And also, we don't allow politicians to draw up the electoral boundaries like they do in other systems. So we've got those guardrails, but guardrails can't stop a tidal wave. And this is happening around the world, and we have the same problems creeping up in ours. You're seeing it bubbling up now in our system. People are very unhappy about home ownership. Apparently, we can't do anything about it. We own a continent, right? And if we don't do something about it, people will make a decision. Hungry people eat one way or another, and it's either it's dealt with in a moderating fashion through trade unionism and lifting wages and lifting income and lifting access to wealth, or it's dealt with the storming the Bastille, but it's dealt one way or another. And so I worry about that a lot. And, I don't think we're necessarily taking those challenges seriously enough. And so, whether or not our political class is listening to it, in the end, the people will replace the political class with somebody that either makes the changes or burns it to the ground. And asking people to defend something that's not working is a pretty bad starting point. So you can have all the best cyber tools in the world. You have the best military in the world, but if you don't have the best ideas that are delivering, then you're not going to get the passionate defense of it.
So this is a national security audience. Now, there's one person in this room I know who knows what the Gini coefficient is and who actually understands some of those issues that you've talked about. What should this audience be thinking about advocating for? So we spend a lot of time talking about cybersecurity and terrorism and radical extremism, and I could go on. But the case that you're making is the antecedents. They're not just fueled by bad actors offshore who try to radicalise kids in their bedrooms. There's something much more fundamental. So for a national security audience, what is the message? Is it that you should be talking to your colleagues who are running the Department of Social Services?
Well, they're all linked. What I'm saying is, like, putting national security in a bubble and thinking that it's just army on army is not how we won the Cold War. We had a complex strategy. Yeah, we had a very forensic lens on the military challenges. We had a very forensic lens on the informational struggle. And where we also had a very key focus on was economics and making sure that economics was distributive economics. That a middle class lifestyle in the West, it's not just a thing that's good, it's actually something that's aspirational, not just for our people, but for theirs too. Why does Xi Jinping want to get rid of Taiwan? Not because Taiwan's some kind of major threat to mainland China, because it looks a hell of a lot like democratic China. And so that's why strong, vibrant, successful democracies are threatening. They're threatening because of the power of their example. And so I think, people need to stick to their knitting here. Clearly, I'm not asking everybody to start brushing up on Marx and others. You hopefully got better things to do. Although I saw there was a Marx poster around the campus. So, as a former AW official and someone who fought the comms, we need to get back to work, I think. But I kid, obviously. But I think ideology is something we stopped talking about, and I think after 1991, we very much dusted our hands and said, "Job done. We won. They lost. Game over." And for 30 years, we stopped talking about ideology. What you're up against is some of the most ideological regimes in history, and we don't understand what our ideas are. Like, can anyone comfortably get up and passionately defend democracy and why it matters in a rousing way? We tend to just deliberate in a very technocratic manner that's cold, bloodless, and not exactly going to get you, jumping to your feet. And so the fact that we have not clearly and vibrantly articulated why our system is not just co-equal to, but better than other systems is an important thing.
Can I jump in there on those?
Yeah,
I think
go right ahead.
It's self-evident, right? So let's talk about a strange way of looking at it. But look at the southern border crisis in the United States right now. There are hundreds of thousands of people putting their lives at risk to cross into the United States, across the Rio Grande, putting their lives at risk to do so, because even America, with all its very well-publicised flaws and limitations, is still a beacon for them and a point of attraction to them and an opportunity for a better life from them. And they're coming from all around the world, not just South and Central America, to do that. And how many people are crossing the border into China? I mean, how many people are fleeing towards that? How many people are fleeing towards Russia? I mean, authoritarian systems, how many people are going from South Korea to North Korea? Like, these authoritarian systems are not attractive. They're inherently ugly. People don't want to live there. They want to flee them, and they want to live in our lifestyles and our systems. Now, we may not be as good and rousing as they were in the 1980s and articulating that in a bold and passionate way. I accept that criticism, right? But I think it's self-evident to the people of the world.
No, I agree with you. No one's more passionate about democracy than a recent refugee from a political dictatorship. But they're not the people that are losing faith with democracy. And if we're not convinced of our own arguments, I think, no, you're right. It's JFK. We don't have to build a wall to keep our people in. If you look at the flow, not just of refugees, if you look at the flow of millionaires are flowing out of China and flowing into places like Australia. In fact, Australia is the largest single recipient of millionaires. That may be a good or bad thing, but nevertheless, that's just people choosing to live in democracies. But if they corrode from within, there's nowhere to go.
So Lydia, you mentioned the Edelman Trust Index, and absent Misha jumping on a podium out here somewhere at the ANU wearing a T-shirt that espouses some particular sort of ideology. I will tell you that I did wear certain T-shirts of that kind in the late 1970s when I was a student at this university, when there was a student union, and we won't go there because it's all a bit... but talk to us if you can. I know, like, there's some stuff that just needs to stay on tour. So talk to us. You talked about the trust index and the decline in the trust in democracy. That is something that's been going on for a while, I think, from the last time I looked at those numbers. What do you think that means? And if you were, again, in a politician's shoes, is it just a question of standing here and talking robustly about the importance of democracy? Is that enough? What are the things we should be doing, saying, thinking, if we are going to buttress what I think everyone in this room would consider to be unbelievably important?
Well, okay, so yes, I think a couple of things. So I think in Australia in particular, there's always been a very healthy level of distrust and skepticism of institutions, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it actually can be quite a good thing. Even if you take it to its extremes. I've been doing a lot of research work, particularly around disinformation and conspiracy theories lately, and I've been kind of delving into the literature on that. And it's been really interesting to note that a lot of times we frame these as very negative things. And for the most part, I think that they are. But a lot of times that dynamic can drive necessary change. That type of skepticism is actually necessary. That agonism is necessary in democracies. So I guess it's my way of also saying that we need to also try to reframe some of the things that we think are weaknesses in our democracy. And sometimes they are weaknesses, but sometimes they can be sources of strength as well. So we've talked a lot about, China, the CCP in particular, and kind of what their challenges are, and the fact that they we wouldn't want their challenges, and our democratic systems are superior, of which I agree. But if you take a look at from the framing from that perspective, there's a book that was written a while back by Wang Huning called America Against America. And it's a fascinating book, and it shows from the CCP's perspective and outlines all of the things that are wrong with democracy, how we can kind of erode ourselves and eat ourselves in from the inside. And that's a way that a lot of these countries, the CCP and its citizens, are looking at democratic countries, not just in the CCP, but a lot of, the BRICS countries as well. So I think it points to a decline in soft power of democracies around the world, accompanied by this democratic erosion. And a lot of that has to do with both internal and external factors, both of how we conduct ourselves with our national policy, economic, national security, social policy, but also how we conducted our foreign policy. So a lot of democracy promotion efforts in the wake of the global war on terror have really done significant damage to that democratic soft power. So that's one point. However, going in a circular way back to my original point, I think we can reframe some of that messiness around democracy as actually a strength, because that messiness can sometimes, and often does, lead us, after we go through great periods of challenge, right, into better solutions and better outcomes. That's part of our system. We need to embrace it. And sometimes things that look in the very immediate to medium term as crises or threats or dysfunction can actually oftentimes lead to positive outcomes in democracy. So if we take a look at, for example, the United States, which is going through quite a difficult period of polarization and extremism right now, and the mainstreaming of extremism for a variety of ways, and the breakdown of social cohesion. Whenever I get really anxious about American democracy, which I do often, I think back and I look at a more recent history, say during the 1960s. All right. So we talked about JFK, but at the time, that was a period of massive amounts of polarization, political violence, political assassinations, civil disobedience, opposition to American foreign policy in the Vietnam War. We had the National Guard shooting on campuses. We had the assassination of civic leaders and racial unrest. And America got through that massive disruption to better outcomes. There was more racial equality. There was, a revival around some of the norms and greater equalities in that society. And so we're always going to go through these periods of ebbs and flows. And so to come back to your point about, distrust of institutions, I think they do come back in those periods of ebbs and flows. I think it's incumbent, yes, on our political leaders and the people that we elect to act with integrity and with a ethos of service. But it's also interesting to note that the distrust in institutions, it's not just political. So in a democracy, right, one of our strengths is that we have various pillars of direction and power within our societies, not just in government. So there's businesses, the corporate sector, civil society, education, medical establishment, all these other institutions. And what we're seeing is the distrust in institutions is not just limited to political actors in government, but across those boards. And so we actually have to take the focus, we have to spread the focus in terms of all of these other institutions and how we can bolster our trust and confidence in them, because all of these other things underpin our democracy, not just the political and government actors.
So I'm going to come to the audience just to get a couple of questions from out there. So get your questions ready. But let me just ask you one thing, and you're not the first person to make that point about the sort of the sine wave of things that have tested democracies over the years, and particularly that comment about the 60s and probably early 70s. I lived in North America at that time, went through a number of those real challenges. And I think in the midst of those, I mean, I was quite young, but there was certainly, there was not a sense there was an easy way out of this. Is there anything you see at the moment which you think make it, our current circumstance more fundamentally testing? Now, we've already come to the things that are different, the cyber issues, all of those things. So is there anything about the current context you think is more worrying other than just expect that it'll kind of sort itself out?
Yes. So two things that kind of blunt my optimism and that reach of history. One, I think, is the Trump factor, because I think his influence and his potential for re-election is not just going to impact America, but globally, and particularly allies like Australia. I think we're burying our head in the sand a little bit about the impact that a potential Trump re-election will have in terms of our relationship with that key ally and in terms of global democracy. So one of the main differences, I think, from those periods of upheaval that I was just describing earlier is that you did not have the person who was holding the highest office of the land contributing to that dynamic and justifying it. And so that's a huge key difference, right? The other one is around technology, not just in terms of cyber threats, but just in terms of, I mean, if we thought that social media has wreaked havoc on our societies, on our attention spans, on the growth of disinformation and extremism, I mean, what is AI going to do, right? I think we're wholly unprepared for what that's going to mean. So I think that technological factor is the other one.
Yep, thank you. So I think so far we're on the glass half empty part of this discussion. So here's the opportunity for colleagues in the room to ask, yes, and I have somebody over here. And can we ask the same courtesy, can you tell us who you are? I just noticed, by the way, that you're collectively technologically incompetent. Not one of you throughout the entire conference has put a question in the app. Don't start now because I've stopped looking. So over here, thank you.
Thank you, panel, for your talk. Melissa Code from the Mandarin. It's well known that healthy democracies also require some appetite for or appreciation of the possibility of change. And to preserve a healthy democracy, the citizenry need to believe and understand that. And so I'd just like to sort of pick up on Lydia's point about empowering and bolstering these other institutions beyond the political and government ones. How do we change and transform those institutions to inspire the citizenry to believe that change is possible, true meritocracy is possible, a better life than the current struggle is possible?
I'll start with Lydia, but I'll give the others a crack as well.
I mean, we'll just quickly, I think anything that we can do to have those institutions be truly reflective of the multicultural, pluralistic society that we live in is an important first step. A lot of times if you take a look at, key institutions and, elite power structures and stuff, oftentimes that's often not the case. So I think we need to do more work to have them be more reflective of our societies, but then also to recognize that, again, going back to spruiking the strengths that we have. I mean, I'm a migrant twice over. So my family migrated from Egypt to America. And, to the point, to both James and Misha's points about your sense of perception of the positiveness and the challenges changes when you're coming from different contexts, right? So I think a lot of times we underappreciate some of those things. So having that acknowledgement, particularly with younger generations, it's not to say that, you don't have it so bad. And when I was back in the day, it's not so much that, but it's just trying to offer a little bit of that perspective. And then I'm a migrant here to Australia coming from the United States, which we've been talking about its very recent challenges. I'm even having that perspective, I'm even more grateful to be in a country like Australia right now in this point in time from that. So I think doing more work to make them more reflective of the societies in which we actually live in, to reflect the diversity and the egalitarianism that that we so often spruik, right? And also to maybe foster a healthy appreciation of what we have.
Misha?
I might just say that I'm always skeptical of systemic changes to deal with the cultural problem. I think we have the system that we need because Australia is a great country and it didn't happen by accident, right? I mean, clearly at some stage, the royal we were able to construct a pretty amazing society here. And it still is, in my opinion, the best place in the world to live. And trust me, when you've been around the world to some nasty places, it's very grateful to be from Australia. It's like you've won the world lotto to be an Australian. But I worry about young people feeling that the system doesn't deliver. An election is not just a performatory task. It has to have meaningful change attached to it. And so it's a twin challenge, right? The politicians have got to be better, but voters have got to expect and demand better of their politicians. Politicians respond to the demand signals as well, right? Not to speak for the senator here or put him on the spot, but fundamentally, if we, the royal we, hold our politicians more accountable, I think we'll get a better outcome. But then also, I think one thing, and again, not to make excuses, one of the biggest differences between now and other periods where we've had big change, people talk about the Hawke-Keating government, special interest groups are much more organised now against change. So minor, tiny changes in legislative approach has disastrous consequences that's going to cause all manner of totemic destruction across the entire economy or the entire society, which are always overblown. But that hyperbole makes it very hard for politicians to move. And so that's probably one thing I think is underappreciated. It's the sophistication of special interest groups who have learned to campaign like political outfits. And that is really gumming up the system. And then there's social media and. But holding politicians more accountable, voters still have the agency here. And I think the system works if we make it work.
James, institutions?
Most voters' engagement with the political system is very practical. It's not ideological, it's not philosophical, and they probably don't have strong views about how the political system works in an institutional sense. They care about what outcomes the political system delivers them in their real lives. And so I partly share the concern that both Misha and Lydia have articulated about inequality, although with a slightly different emphasis. The data, as I understand it, shows that income inequality in Australia historically has been quite stable, but wealth inequality has exacerbated, particularly in more recent years, and it has a very strong generational component to it. And we've just been through the last 3 or 4 years of the biggest boom in asset prices in modern economic history in the West, partly as a result of COVID and other and the economic response to it. And so if you were an asset owning person entering into that environment, you've had this massive wealth boost. And if you're a person who aspired to gain assets, particularly in the housing market, you've just had the bar raised for you in a really significant way. And to that comes this point about disillusionment for young people. Why would they believe in and support the institutions of politics that haven't solved that problem for them and have stood by and watched while that problem increased? So home ownership and housing affordability, I think, is at the heart of that for young people. I'm 36. My generation and below has particularly grappled with this, and many of them are now saying in some polls, 3/4 of them believe that they will never own a home in their lifetime. For Australia, that's a radical change. We have traditionally been a property-owning democracy. If you take away the property-owning component of that, what interest do those people have in maintaining the system as it is? I think they might be open to more radical changes than are necessary to solve that problem, but it's incumbent on the political class, the current occupants of the political class, to solve that problem for them so they have investment and buy-in in the political system as it is.
Thank
Can
you.
I just very super quickly just on that institute, I know we don't have time, but I think again with the issue with young people in institutions, I think one of the things is that not only is there a greater distrust of institutions, there's overall a decline of institutions. Institutions traditional ones have been breaking down. So organized religion, unions, other similar things. So I think because we've seen not just a growing distrust, but a breakdown of some traditional institutions, it's now incumbent upon the current generation and younger generations to actually build up alternative institutions. If they're not happy with those old ones, if those ones have collapsed or seriously declining, then we've got to come up with other alternative institutions that people can get around. And that's getting particularly more difficult now in this digital age where so much of our lived interaction is now online instead of real life.
I have time for one more, and there's somebody just there with their hand up. Thank you.
Hi, Afia Archon from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. So just picking up on a point that Senator Paterson made. So you mentioned that countries like the US seem to be beacons of hope for migrants, despite some of those domestic issues. And I think Australia can be said to be the same. Like, look at us having a very multicultural society where half Australians are born overseas or have at least one parent who was born overseas. But also, as you mentioned, we see state actors like China trying to really pick at our social fabric and use disinformation to really criticize some elements of our multiculturalism. For example, China using some of these social grievances around some of the discrimination or racism we've seen in Australia, and using that to try and delegitimize Australia or other democracies as well. And we saw that in particular with the CCP trying to use the referendum for their own purposes to show how we don't treat our minority communities and First Nations communities properly. Or during COVID, for example, we saw the rise of East Asian hate. So what can we do when it comes to trying to combat this form of disinformation when it is state actors, and when we are trying to project ourselves as a very diverse, pluralistic society, when other countries around the world are trying to delegitimize ourselves based on that?
Most authoritarian systems are highly monocultural, and they believe that is a strength for them, and they believe our pluralism or our multiculturalism or our diversity is a weakness for us and something to be weaponized against us. We have to be very conscious of that. That has a couple of obligations on us. One is we have to defend the principles of pluralism very strongly in our system, equal treatment of people based on their race or religion or any other characteristic about them. That's critically important. Our political system defends that. But one is we also need to take proactive steps to defend ourselves against those attempts to weaponize divisions in our society. And you're right, when it is an authoritarian state using a cyber-enabled means to insert disinformation in our system, it may have nothing to do directly with their interests. It may have nothing to do with the Taiwan Straits or the South China Sea. It might be a purely domestic matter, but a fissure in our system that they think they can weaponize and take advantage of. And I think, personally, it's insane that we have given them the means to do so by allowing them to control the flow of information about news and the world, particularly to young people on social media platforms. In the Cold War, would we have allowed the Soviet Union to buy a television station? No way. TikTok today is far more powerful than even a television station was in the height of the Cold War, because everybody on it, and it's a very high proportion of our population, is having a personally individualized experience that neither you or I can see. And so we really have no idea the way in which a thumb has been put on the algorithmic scale to weaponize disinformation in a way that harms our democracy. And if we just sit by and watch and let that happen and take no proactive steps to deal with it, we will wake up afterwards and look back at this and think it was a colossal strategic mistake.
Lydia?
Well, I think Senator Paterson makes a good point, particularly around TikTok, around it being an issue of trade symmetry as well. Because I think if you take a look at, say the CCP, they don't allow Facebook, they don't allow Twitter, they don't allow any of those platforms to be in their society. So we have to think about, one, this issue of trade symmetry, but broader than that, this is not just an issue around TikTok by any means. Disinformation is rife on all of the platforms that we are using, whether they are originated out of the CCP or Silicon Valley. And so I think this goes to a broader, dire need for better regulation of the tech sector, not just regulation in terms of, things around the content, but also regulation, around antitrust and the business models and the economic systems driving these monopolistic companies. Now, we have a real challenge, whether it's, platforms like TikTok that originated in China or ones that are, that are allied of us, because none of these platforms are indigenous to Australia. So we're dealing here with multinational global companies that we have to really, that we can't do on our own. Australia is a very small market, so we're not going to have as much influence as the United States or the EU or any of those other countries. So we really have to look at this in terms of a foreign policy issue, a trade issue, and to coordinate globally with like-minded partners in terms of dealing with this challenge. So yeah, I'll just leave it there.
But do you think politicians will have the stomach to deal with that challenge? We've just seen Trump change his position on TikTok.
Mm-hmm. I think that, look, there's massive amounts of challenges in terms of tech regulation, but I am heartened that over the years we've moved away from this, oh, gee whiz, isn't this technique type of framework and this tech utopian framework, thinking that technology is going to make everything better, to a much deeper recognition of some of the challenges that it poses, in addition to the positive aspects. And there are positive aspects, with this digital transformation. And so I think there's a greater awareness of the need to do something, and we're seeing much stronger movement. And I think particularly being led out of the EU as well, and in the current administration in the US in terms of their antitrust measures. So I think there's scope for some hope in this area.
It'd be worth just everyone in this room reflecting, if they've got children of a certain age, teenagers, whether they have any idea what's on their TikTok feed, because odds to a brick they're on TikTok, and it's worth knowing what's on it.
It's actually quite scary. I was listening to a podcast which profiles Trump voters and young Trump voters, but also young progressive voters were part of this episode. It talked about their fealty to TikTok. It is actually quite stunningly scary how much they've internalized the talking points of TikTok in terms of why it shouldn't be banned, why it's important. And there's this real big paradox we've created for ourselves, where we've degraded the quality of our own institutions to the point where the distrust, when you present an argument of trust, so you shouldn't trust TikTok because it belongs to authoritarians. Well, our news is so good, right? Our information is so good, our government's so good. And so it's a very difficult spiral to break out of. The question specifically around diversity, one thing I'd say, and I agree with the Senator when he says it's a strength, it's a feature of our systems. Authoritarians look strong from the outside because they appear, orderly, and they're able to make decisions. And they go, wouldn't that be great? But Xi Jinping has stuffed his economy because no one could tell him these are bad ideas. Now, I made a point before about special interest groups. So a little bit of special interest group organising in China might have stopped a couple of these really dumb ideas. They've set back China's economy profoundly from taking hold. Or who knows, a one-child policy many years ago. So having the chaos of democracy may make it feel like we're not getting things done, but it does make the quality of our ideas that much better. And the other thing I'd say around diversity is that it also helps us attract the best talent to us. They've got a brain drain, and we should lean into that a bit. I think where we're lacking a bit of confidence is we're seeing threat vectors where we say, well, if you're coming from an authoritarian regime, you might be a spy, and we've got to be careful about whether or not, and I can understand some of the risks there, but I think they should fear the brain drain more than we should fear the security risks, and taking away their best talent, I think, is a key weapon that we're not really using well. I'd ban TikTok, and I'd also ban WeChat for what it's worth. I can't believe we allowed that to operate in our systems, particularly for the principles of reciprocity that were pointed out earlier.
So it turns out we have time for one more question. Bonus round. It's a bit like being on hard quiz, really. All right, we'll take two, and then we'll see how we go. So I've got someone over there and someone down there. So let's have both of them. Someone's got the microphone. So the gentleman over there.
Yep.
Yes.
Me? Yep.
Please
Great.
ask your question.
Thanks. Thanks, panel, for the discussion. It was really very insightful. I guess my question's around...
Can you tell us who you are?
Oh, sorry, Pat from Defence.
Pat
Sorry.
from Defence.
Yep.
It's like, yeah, he is, isn't he? It's a bit like when you used to say, I'm Jane from Attorney General's, and you knew exactly where you were from.
Okay, so my question, it kind of goes to that. We are often talking about us versus them. So we're often going democracies versus authoritarian regimes, which is important. I think that, as we've discovered today, it's a very important conversation. I think maybe one thing we're not very good at doing is looking between democracies. looking at different democracies. I mean, representative democracies are not the only type of democracy. There's direct democracies, there's social democracies. I guess I just wanted to tease out how important it is to kind of look between democracies across the world to see what different places are doing, and also looking beyond the Anglosphere, which is, I think, quite important.
Okay, we'll take that one. People can think about it. And we'll just take, there was a woman over here. Awesome. Thank you.
Hi panel, thank you for your remarks. It's Laura Sobels from CT Group and a member of the Youth Council here at the National Security College. Thinking about these things pragmatically and how do you actually shift the dial? Looking at Australia's decision makers, it's a realistic fact. Often things and policies are motivated by money. What can we afford to do? What can we afford not to do? Successive Australian budgets across successive Australian governments have been essentially underwritten by the resources sector in Australia. Critical minerals, mining, resources, the export of these products to places like China have fundamentally underwritten our economic prosperity and social security. I think if you took a straw poll of a lot of the electorate, many people might not either know that or reject it on the basis that they wish it wasn't the case. So my question to the panel is, I'd like to get your reflections on how do we have a discussion in Australia about the fundamental link between domestic policies and geopolitical advantage?
Okay, no small issues in both of those questions. I'll start down that end.
Very quickly, the first question, I think it's a really good point. It's a dangerous thing to make democracy seem like it's an Anglo thing or a European thing. I always say that we should be closer to Japan, closer to Korea, closer to Indonesia. Why? Because they're democracies, right? And because it's not about how you look, it's quality of your ideas. I think the Quad is a great example of 4 democracies working together through shared concerns. We've seen reports of AUKUS maybe becoming JAUKUS. And then there was Canada, so I don't know. Someone quickly think about what that acronym is. I don't know. But I think it's a really important lens to overlay it, and it can't be about ethno-nationalism posing as democracy. Democracy is about an idea that belongs to everybody, and we shouldn't fall into the trap where Cold War thinking, as the CCP puts it, is really kind of a trigger word to try to make it about the Anglosphere. The second question, well, I'm a former AWU leader, so I'm all about mining more, right? So I might not be the best person to ask, and I'm certainly not popular at Labor Party conferences when I go along and argue these things. But I think overall, you're absolutely right. Once upon a time, I think John Howard put it for a very long time that we didn't have to choose between our economic relationship with China and our security relationship with the United States. Increasingly, that choice has been forced upon us. And so there is no longer a division between economic concerns or geopolitical concerns. They've fused into one, and we need to be clear about that. In terms of the mining question, more specifically, my advice to mining companies would be pay a bit more tax to have a bit more esteem in the community, have more people defending your cause, pay higher wages to have people defending your cause. And lastly, let's have more downstream industry policy to buy more people into the employment outcome. Then you've got more stakeholders, more people to gum up the processes who are arguing in favour of your sector, and not just it being a narrow interest, because a narrow interest is a disruptable interest.
Okay, thank you. So very briefly from our other two.
So quickly, I think to the first question, I think it points to a really important dynamic that we haven't really touched on in the way that this kind of debate has been going. Because you're right, we have talked a lot about democracy versus autocracy, but Australia has a lot of allies and partnerships with countries that are not democracies like ours, and those are really important. So we, our foreign policy and national security can't just be completely ideologically driven in a sense that we only have strong relations or interactions with like-minded countries, right? There's certainly an ease to it. We might have a shared language, that certainly helps. But, as our alliance relationship with the US shows, it's quite strong, it's fundamental, but it's often, that doesn't mean that there aren't particular tensions. So I think for Australia in particular, where it's situated globally, and its position in the world, in the here and now, it has to come up with a really nimble and robust foreign policy that allows it to engage with regional actors and global actors that don't share our system of government, right? And that's critical. And I think it's a very obvious point that we probably should have made early on. So thank you for that question. I think on the second point, I would just kind of quickly say that we talked a bit about, some of the issues that globalization has brought to the fore in terms of the challenges around democracy, right? So it's kind of increased inequality. There's been, certain tensions around trade that have impacted us. It's created global winners and losers that have impacted the way that our democratic societies have functioned. But globalization has been very, very good to us. And right now, there is a risk of some of that breaking down. And we've seen it particularly with the COVID pandemic. Supply chain issues have really highlighted, there's vulnerabilities around that. I think global great power competition as well is starting to reveal kind of this elements of economic fragmentation that I think if these trends continue and there's risk of them going and we're not adapted at kind of overcoming them, that's going to cause us some real economic pain and challenges. So I think that your question really points to, two things. One, that we can't discount how much benefit Australia has had from a system that has allowed for the free flow of trade and goods and globalization. That would be an important point that I think your question points to.
Okay, and very briefly, James.
I agree with everything Misha and Lydia said in response to Pat's question, so I won't add to it. Just to Laura's, I am much less anxious than I would have been 3 or 4 years ago about our economic resilience on the export side because we survived the economic coercion campaign from China. Our biggest trading partner launched an unprecedented campaign of economic coercion, and the Productivity Commission estimates it did 0.1% damage to our GDP. Very uncomfortable for some sectors and some firms, but our economy survived that. I'm much more anxious about our economic resilience on the import side, because if next time a foreign adversary decides to block imports that we need for our economy to function instead of blocking our exports, that might not be as easy a problem to solve as this one was. We were just able to divert to other markets for commodities that are essentially, perfect substitutes of each other. There are some markets that are so heavily dominated by authoritarian states that we right now have no alternative except to source from them. If they cut that off, that could be a very uncomfortable experience. We've got a lot of work to do to deal with that.
On that cheery note, I think you will agree we could keep going with this discussion. It's been an unbelievably rich conversation. Misha Zelinsky, Lydia Khalil, and of course Senator James Paterson, can I ask you all to thank them for their time?